Oh, God, yes. I remember the good as well as the bad. It can cause depression if you allow yourself to do that, Aunt Lucy said. I can only imagine, I told her. Keith interrupted again. Fred, he pointed at me, he's looking for someone who was here at the same time. The only thing he knows about him is that he was blonde with blue eyes. That's it. No height, no weight, no rank, no assignment, not even his initials. Aunt Lucy laughed. No, Mom, I said. Calling me Mom is a waste of good oxygen, Fred. I'm Aunt Lucy. Give me time to think and maybe ask around. Does it matter? Keith looked at me, and I answered, yes, Aunt Lucy, it's important. Oh, he was about the same age as me when I was here, if that helps. And he was in the army, officer or private? I suppose he was an officer if he was in the army, I said. So you don't even know if he was in the service? Aunt Lucy asked. No, I don't. Or a civil servant? No, I'm sorry. I know it's not much to go on, I said. Yeah, there's just nothing to target there. Can't be more than 2,000 blonde-haired blue-eyed men I've encountered in the last few years. But I'll see if I can narrow down the time frame, Aunt Lucy said. She took both of our phone numbers. 2 days later, she called Keith. I've been thinking about the man you asked about. I don't remember any blonde-haired and blue-eyed soldiers, either officers or privates, who were about the right age. But I know 2 civilians who work for the Office of Postal Engineers. One has worked there for about 30 years, so he's probably too old. The other has been working there for about 10 years. He's in charge of new construction now, but he used to be the head of the plumbing department. His name is Kurt Weber. There are about 15 other blue-eyed blondes on post, but the ages don't fit. And I didn't bother trying to remember civilians living off base because I assumed that when Major Sadler was here, he didn't have time to make many civilian friends, Aunt Lucy informed us. Keith told me, and I immediately started planning how to meet Weber, find out if he was the right man, and maybe get a little revenge. The men who prey on the wives of our military personnel are the second lowest form of life on the planet. The lowest, of course, are those who prey on wives when the serviceman is overseas. These bastards deserve the worst fate imaginable, I said. Keith could almost read my mind. Let's take a look at this guy, he said. The first thing he did was call Aunt Lucy. Is there any legal way to get Weber's address and phone number? Of course, she said. I have a civilian directory in my desk. 30 seconds later, we had both pieces of information. I love you, Aunt Lucy, Keith told her. We got into his rental car, and at 3:45 p.m., we waited outside the main office of the engineer's post office. We recognized him immediately when he came out of the building. He was a good-looking guy, and I hated him at first sight. He headed to his car, and we followed him to make sure he was on his way home. He did. We sat within sight of his house for a couple of hours. He never came out, but someone we mistook for his wife was working in the flower bed in the yard, and 3 kids, all with blonde hair, were playing around it. You don't have to stay here and do this, I told Keith. Damn, this is fun. I'm sitting here wondering what we can do with this bastard. I have some ideas, he replied. We compared notes. The next morning, I was sitting on the next street over from Weber's house in my rental car. I was hoping he was golfing or doing some home repairs, so maybe he was on his way to the local hardware or lumber store. I had been sitting there for almost 2 hours when I saw his car pull out of the garage and speed down the street. Thank God, I thought. I didn't feel like sitting here all day to see if he'd gone somewhere, but I was willing to do it if I had to. I followed him to the Home Depot. We parked, and I followed him into the store. He was obviously known there because he talked to a few of the employees. There was a spot right in front of the door where there was a coffee urn. I knew enough about Home Depot to know that their regular contractor customers could treat themselves. Weber helped himself and stood sipping his drink while he chatted with one of the salesmen behind the counter. Watching Mr. Weber, I realized one thing: not only did he have sex with my wife and make her pregnant, but he also chewed gum with his mouth open. Other than spitting on the sidewalk, I couldn't think of anything more disgusting. The clerk Weber was chatting with had to go help a customer, so Weber took one last sip of coffee, spit the gum into a paper cup, and walked away, unwrapping another piece of gum. I walked over to the trash can, looked in it, and saw right on top a paper coffee cup with a pack of gum in it. I looked around, didn't see anyone, and took the cup. I got in the car and called Keith. I told him what I had. He laughed and told me to hurry back, that he might have something bigger by the time I got there. When I approached, he was literally jumping from place to place and waving some papers around. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "You won't really believe it." He grabbed my arm. "Look at this." "No, you better sit down." I did. He sat down next to me and put the papers in front of me. "Now look." There were a few names and an address. "So what?" I asked. "That's Hope's name, address, and her family's name. Her name is Sarah now, Sarah Randolph." I hacked into the files of an adoption agency. Those files are encrypted better than the nuclear missile launch codes carried by the President of the United States. Then he stopped and calmed down. "Well, I didn't personally hack their files, my brother did, but it's the same thing." I started to laugh. "That's great, Keith, but what exactly am I going to do with it?" "I have no idea, but you have them. Maybe we can blackmail someone." "Oh, that's great. I can already see the headlines: 2 Army officers try to blackmail 6-year-old foster child. That's a great one." He tossed the papers on the coffee table and leaned back in his chair. "Yes, I see where you're going with this." He got a little flustered again. "But we cracked their defenses. That's something." "Yeah, that's something," I said, laughing. I carried the papers and coffee cup back to my bachelor officer's quarters, and placed them on the desk. I had no idea why I did it, but I looked up the address where Hope lived, and drove there early Sunday morning. It was almost 200 miles to Corsicana. The house was a typical suburban house. I sat outside for about an hour, observing American suburbia on a typical Sunday: the noise of a few lawnmowers, the screams of children, and the chatter of neighbors. No activity came from Hope's house until almost noon. A car pulled up to the driveway. There were 3 people in the car: a man driving, a woman in the front passenger seat, and a child in the right rear seat. The woman got out of the car, closed her door, and reached for the right rear door. I was at the ready with my cell phone. The woman removed the child from the car seat, and placed the child on the ground, then knelt down to straighten the baby's dress. I had just enough time to take a few pictures. I heard a noise next to my car. A woman and a child were walking by. Sarah, the child next to my car, squeaked and ran towards another child who, I realized, was Hope, and ran towards her. They were only a few feet away from my car, and I took a few more quick pictures. I started my car and drove off before either of the 2 women became interested in the strange car and man parked on their street. I drove a short distance away and stopped to look at the pictures. 4 were absolutely perfect. I could even make out her blue eyes. I drove back to Fort Hood the following week. Keith and I finished the course with ease. We graduated on Friday and then had dinner and a few drinks together. Saturday morning, we went to the airport and flew home, Keith to Alaska and me to Seattle. The following Monday was a school day, so I had the day off. I took Lydia and Hope Margie's DNA reports to the DNA testing center. She didn't remember me until I reminded her about the pacifier. I gave her Lydia and Hope's DNA results and handed her a coffee cup with gum. "See you in 3 weeks," I said as I left. In fact, it only took 2 this time. She gave me the results over the phone. "It's a married couple, no doubt," she said, "mother, father, and child." She would send me the official results in the mail. "Okay," I replied. I had all the information I needed, but what was it for? What was I going to do with it? All it did was confirm that Webber was, in fact, the guy Lydia had cheated with. It took me a week to take the first step. I went to Walmart and bought paper and envelopes. I also made copies of 2 photographs of Hope and the DNA reports belonging to Webber, Lydia, and Hope. On the DNA reports, I cut off anything that could tell where the report came from. I put it all in an envelope, making sure I had gloves on from the moment I opened the bag of paper and the box of envelopes. I even used self-adhesive stamps and water, not saliva, to seal the envelope. I made every effort to keep it untraceable. I addressed it to Mrs. Kurt Webber at their home address. I also included Lydia's name and her parents' address because I had no idea where she was. Then, I drove to Seattle's main post office and dropped the letter in the mailbox. I had no idea what would happen in Killeen, Texas, home of Fort Hood and the Webber family, when the package arrived. I certainly hoped the package would go to Mrs. Webber and not Mr. Webber. However, I knew what I wanted. I wanted Mrs. Webber to castrate the bastard and then shove his balls down his throat. I felt sorry for the 3 children I saw, assuming they were his, and of course, Mrs. Webber, but nothing was too bad for Webber himself. He must rot in hell. The news from Ken was a little over a month old when I got a call from Aunt Lucy. "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want an honest answer," she said. "I'll do my best," I replied. "Whatever doing isn't good enough. I need complete honesty." "Is that what you and Keith did to Webber, Aunt Lucy?" "I don't mean to sound smart, but what did we do to him?" "Set him up so his wife would file for divorce." "Okay, here's what I did. Keith had nothing to do with it. I told her the truth, most of it anyway. I omitted Keith's part. I figured if anyone was going to get in trouble, it would be me. You certainly stirred up a hornet's nest. Apparently, when his wife received your package, she didn't know if your DNA was his or someone else's, so she did it herself. She took some of his DNA, and sent it off for processing. She also sent the profiles of that woman and the baby. They matched, and that's where it all went downhill." "Who was the woman he was flirting with?" "She was my wife, Aunt Lucy." "Oh, Jesus, I thought it might be something like that." "Well, he was brought into the office yesterday, and he's not thrilled. He was ranting and raving all over the base. Good hearing from you. That his marriage is over is the best news I've heard in a while. I just feel sorry for his family. It was over for me. Lydia and I were divorced, and Webber was on the road to divorce. I folded all the papers Keith had given me into a folder and put it in a box with other things I no longer needed but kept anyway. My life was moving on. Over the next few months, I went on a couple of dates, but nothing much happened. I still spent a lot of time with George and Maran Johnson. I lived in an apartment and occasionally took them out to dinner, but often had dinner at their house and spent more than one night on their couch. I had 1 more year of service left at Fort Lewis and was considering buying a house, but the Army had other ideas. They sent me to the Command and General Staff College, CGSC, at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. I was there for almost a year. There were a lot of socializing opportunities there if you were married or if you had a significant other. Otherwise, the choices were pretty sparse. It was a long but interesting year. After graduation, I returned to Fort Hood. I was surprised because I expected to be sent overseas like 90% of my classmates. Once in Hood, I found myself in Aunt Lucy's office. "How did you get back here?" she asked. "I have no idea," I said. "Yes," came a voice from the past. It was the newly promoted Lieutenant Colonel, LTC, Keith Franklin. He walked into the office, closed the door, and we shook hands. It turned out I needed an assistant, and a recent graduate from C&Gs was just what I needed. So, I asked Keith. Keith and I had talked a few times since we arrived at the seminar but hadn't seen each other. I was glad to see my friend after registering. I took a vacation for 2 weeks. The first thing I did was look for a house. Lydia and I had been saving up to buy one. I assumed that she would get half of it in the divorce, but since she didn't show up in court, I got everything. I went to the First National Bank of Texas branch in Fort Hood and opened an account. I also arranged to have my money transferred to that bank. I told the employee helping me that I also needed to find a house. Just as I said this, the branch manager walked by. He introduced himself as Dwight Randolph. "We moved here about 6 months ago and settled in a brand new neighborhood. The houses are very nice and inexpensive, you get a lot of value for your money," he told me. He then went to his office and returned with a business card from the agent whose services he had used. I decided that if she was good enough for a bank branch manager, she was good enough for me. I called her, and it only took me 3 days to find what I wanted. I paid more than half of the down payment, and the bank was happy to finance the rest. I started working with Keith and moved into my new house. The first things I bought were a bed, a chair, a big TV, and a lawnmower. I was spending my first night in my new house. It was already dark outside, and I had no curtains or drapes. There weren't even enough sheets to cover the big front window. I had just opened a beer and was holding a slice of pepperoni pizza in my hand when the doorbell rang. I had long since gotten off the no red meat diet Lydia had kept me on. I opened the door, and there stood a woman. "Hi neighbor," she said. "My name is Samantha Randolph, but everyone calls me Sammy. We live in the neighborhood. We haven't lived here long ourselves, and I just wanted to say hello, introduce myself, and tell you that if you need anything, just ask. Is your wife here?" I smiled. "Fred Sadler, no wife, divorced." I saw her frown. "But don't worry, I don't throw loud wild parties, or even soft wild parties." She smiled. We chatted for a few more minutes before she left. The first week in my new home flew by. On Saturday morning, 3 women rang the doorbell and brought food. They also brought decorating ideas. They had seen my empty house with the lights on at night as I sat in it with nothing but a chair, TV, beer, and pizza. They decided it was time to help me. The ringleader was Sammy Randolph. A couple of hours later, I had a slightly worn but nice leather couch, a dining table and chairs, and a small coffee table to keep the pizza off the floor. The ladies were about to leave when 3 small children came running in, chasing each other. One of the ladies, Ruth, grabbed 2 of them, and Sammy grabbed the 3rd. "Calm down, Sarah," she said as she knelt down beside the child and brushed her blonde hair away from her blue eyes. "This is our new neighbor, Major Sadler." "Hello," she said confidently. "My name is Sarah." I leaned over. "Hi, Sarah," I said, looking into her piercing blue eyes and blonde hair. "How old are you, Sarah?" "It'll be 7 soon." I stood up, and we all said our goodbyes. As soon as they left, I went to the room that was to be my den, found the right box, opened it, and pulled out a folder. In it were the pictures I had taken. It was the same baby. I hadn't paid attention to the names of the foster parents before, but now I did. The adoption papers named Dwight and Samantha Randolph as Hope's adoptive parents. I literally fell on my butt and just sat there. What were the odds? He was an assistant manager of another bank branch in Corsicana, Texas, and then he was promoted and transferred to Killeen in Fort Hood. It was freaking weird. No computer could calculate the probability of this happening. Sammy and her friend mostly decorated my house. It took a few weeks, and when it was done, we had a neighborhood open house. Sammy invited her sister-in-law, Joni Payne, who happened to be divorced. I hadn't enjoyed female companionship in a long time. Joni and I hit it off right away. She was the last to leave the party, and I couldn't wait to call her the next day. We met for lunch and had dinner with Dwight, Sammy, and Sarah. Sarah was short because she wanted to go play with her friends. Over the next few months, we were together as often as possible. The first night we spent together was very good. We were sitting at the kitchen island when the doorbell rang. I threw on my robe and went to answer it. It was Sammy. "Good afternoon, Fred," she said as she walked inside. We were wondering, she saw Joni. "Well, what do we have here?" she asked, heading toward her sister-in-law. Joni was sitting on a stool eating a ham and cheese sandwich. As Sammy approached her, she set the sandwich aside and turned to face her sister-in-law. Her robe was open, and Sammy reached up to close it. Joni, laugh. Too late for modesty, sis. He's already seen everything. In fact, he's... Never mind, Sammy said, spare me the details. Anyway, we were wondering if you, Fred, and since you're here, you, Joni, wanted to go to the mall. Fred, I know you still need a few things for the house. Yeah, like that awful bedspread, Janie added. What's wrong with the bedspread? I picked it out myself, that's what's bad, said Joni, getting up and kissing Sammy on the cheek. I left the room and went upstairs to get dressed. When I came back, they were still discussing my bedspread. When they saw that I was dressed, they fell silent. We'd love to go to the mall, I said, if we can get Joni to get dressed. A few minutes later, she came downstairs in the clothes she had worn to dinner last night. If this keeps up, I'll have to leave my clothes here. I can't go shopping in clothes like this. You can today, I said, pushing her out of the house. Dwight was as surprised as Sammy to see his sister walking out of my house. Don't ask, Sammy, said Dwight. I sat in the front, and the two women and Sarah sat in the back. Joni was reading a book to Sarah, who was already asleep when we arrived at the mall. When we got back in the evening, I drove Joni home. She invited me to have a nightcap and eat a piece of ass. I accepted her offer. The following weekend, Dwight and Sammy asked Janie to watch Sarah, while the two of them went out to dinner. We were in the backyard watching Sarah in her sandbox. Without looking at Joni, I said, she's a beautiful child, isn't she? Yes, she is. Did you know she was adopted? Really? Yes, they've had her since she was born. According to the adoption agency, the birth mother was married, had an affair with a man she doesn't even remember, and got pregnant. Her husband was in the military. She didn't want him to find out about her affair, so she gave Sarah up for adoption. Dwight and Sammy were there to take her home. Sarah is the name her own mother gave her. No, that name was Hope. It's on the birth certificate, but Sammy and Dwight changed it. Sarah suits her better. What happened to the birth mother and her husband? I have no idea. The adoption agency closes their files very tightly. They don't give the birth mother access to information about the adoptive family, and vice versa. Sarah came over and wanted to sit on Jan's lap. She leaned her head against Jan's and fell asleep almost immediately. A few minutes later, Joni asked me to carry Sarah into the bedroom and put her to bed. It was my first time touching her, and I felt very uncomfortable. I gladly laid her down. 7 months later, Joa moved in with me. A year after that, we were married. We had a very happy year until the army intervened. We were told we were being sent to Germany for 3 years of service. We had 60 days to get there. One of the things the government does well is move people, and we were in the country with all of our possessions, including my car, within the allotted time. Germany is a beautiful country, and the area around Heidelberg is spectacular. Joni had never traveled outside of the United States, so she enjoyed adventures and traveling around Europe. One of the first things we did was buy a new car. She was over the moon racing down the freeways as fast as she wanted in a car built for high speeds. We took 2 trips to the States, one when her father and Dwight's father died, the other was for the reunion. Both times, of course, we saw Dwight and Sammy. We saw Sarah at the funeral, but when we went back for the reunion, she was at camp. I breathed a sigh of relief. Sarah and I had never gotten along. I guess some internal mechanism told us both that we weren't going to be friends. I was fine with that. I understood that she had no say in her birth and didn't know who her parents were, but in my mind, she was still the child of my ex-wife and her lover. Joni and I had been trying to have children, but we just never got around to it. We also talked about adoption, but it never went very far. Keith and I remained friends and talked from time to time. He had remarried, and while Joni and I were in Germany, he was stationed in Belgium, and we visited each other more than once. He and I discussed the fantastic turns of events that had led us to where we ended up, and he blamed it all on himself. If he hadn't gotten his brother to hack into the adoption agency, we wouldn't have known who or where Hope was. After 3 years, we received orders to go to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I was going as a new LTC assigned to the post's headquarters as an executive officer under the post commander. This was normally a position for a colonel, not a junior lieutenant colonel, but I didn't mind. In the military world, you don't look a gift horse in the mouth. Joni and I decided to live in government quarters while we served there. Our house in Ken was rented out, and we decided to continue doing so to help me get settled. The staff organized a series of briefings with the various departments that support the post. One of the briefings was to be given by a postal engineer. Representatives from that department, as well as the postal engineer himself, were already in the conference room when I arrived. I sat down in my seat at the table and watched as a blue-eyed civilian stood up to begin his speech. His hair was slightly blonde with a touch of gray. He introduced himself as Kurt Weber. I just stared at him. He had been talking for an hour, and I hadn't heard a word, and my gaze never left his face. It was obvious that he was uncomfortable with me looking at him. At the end of his speech, he asked if I had any questions. "Tell me, Mr. Weber, have you ever been to Fort Hood?" "Yes, sir. I was in the engineering department." "Did you like it there?" "Yes, sir." "Why did you leave?" "It's rather personal, sir." "You are correct. I withdraw the question. I just like to know about the people I work with. I seem to recall a scandal at the Fort Hood Engineering Department a few years ago. Do you know anything about that?" "I vaguely recall something about one thing. There was someone cheating, if I remember correctly." "Ah, well, I just remembered something. Thanks for the brief. If you need anything at headquarters, feel free to contact me." Just in case you forgot, I pointed to the name tag on my uniform. "My name is Sadler. Sadler." Fred Sadler. I wouldn't want you to forget it. I was still looking straight into his eyes, and I could see the light bulb turn on and his eyes get huge. Kurt Weber became several different colors, ranging from red to pale gray. I got up and walked away. In the afternoon, I learned that Mr. Kurt Weber had requested a transfer. Unfortunately for him, this request had to go through me. When I received it the next day, I wrote in large letters response and added a handwritten note: I have plans that involve Mr. Weber's expertise. He will play a key role in the realization of these plans. The next day, to the surprise of almost everyone, Mr. Kurt Weber tendered his immediate resignation. I signed it. Every day, I fell more and more in love with Joni. I watched her get more and more beautiful and sexy. Every morning, I looked in the mirror, and all I saw was an aging middle-aged man. I wondered what she saw in me, but whatever it was, I was grateful for it. We enjoyed our time together, and time in the form of years flew by quickly, much faster than I wanted it to. We were serving in Alaska and traveled to Ken to visit Sammy and Dwight. On our first evening, they engaged us in a decision they had made with Sarah, who was now almost 18 years old. She had known from the beginning that she was adopted but was now interested in trying to find her biological parents. Dwight and Sammy supported her decision, but the adoption agency gave them no help, saying they had to comply with the laws. All we heard that first day was how archaic the laws were and that they needed to be reformed, especially considering how important it was for an adopted child to know the health status of the birth parents. They decided to go to a website dedicated to DNA and ancestral origins, send Sarah's DNA, and see what happens. Sarah thought it would be nice to have her own mother come to her high school graduation, but since it was only a couple of weeks away, they decided that was unlikely. That night, Joni and I were already in bed when she asked, "What are you going to do about Sarah?" "What about her?" "Come on, Fred, married couples don't have secrets, or shouldn't have any. I found your little file 6 months after we were married. She can avoid DNA testing if you tell them everything you know." "Oh," I said. "Yeah, oh man. Why have you been silent all these years?" "I'm not sure. I guess I knew how sensitive you'd be about it, and Dwight and Sammy didn't need to know, so I kept quiet. But now it's become important, and you have to address it. Any suggestions on how I can do this?" "Just tell the story, I suppose." "How do you think they'll take it?" "Dwight is my brother and just like me, so he'll take it normally. Sammy is the dark horse." "Okay, tomorrow we'll get Sarah out of the house and tell them." She leaned over and kissed me gently. "Do I ever bore you?" she asked. "What a silly question," I said. "Of course it isn't. Why did you even ask it?" "Because you haven't touched me all day," I grinned and reached for the buttons on her pajamas. "I can fix that right now." The next morning was Sunday. Sarah was picked up by her best friend, and they went to the mall. I gathered the 4 of us around the table, took a deep breath, and began. I started by telling them that Joni and I had packed our things before we went downstairs, so we were ready if they wanted to kick us out. They looked at us, and Joni shrugged. "Sarah doesn't need to give DNA in case she finds her biological parents." "I know who they are," I said. The looks I got from both of them told me it was best to explain myself, so I told them the whole story. When I finished, I took a deep breath and looked around the table. Dwight was just staring at me, and Sammy had tears in her eyes. After a few seconds, she stood up, walked over to me, took my hands, pulled me to her, and hugged me. Oh, poor guy, living with that all these years and not being able to talk about it. No one deserves that. She hugged me again. "What do you think, Dwight?" she asked her husband. I'm trying to calculate the probability of how we all ended up together. I don't think there's a big enough number, he said. So what do we do now? Asked Sammy, returning to her chair. I think Fred should contact his ex-wife and invite her to the prom since Sarah wants her there, Joni said. Why me? Protested I. Because you started it, Dwight grinned. But who's going to contact Weber? Not me, I said, and told them about the last time I saw him. You never told me that, Joni said. I didn't realize you knew the whole story, did I? She leaned over and kissed me. I love this woman, I thought. Later that day, when Sarah returned, Dwight and Sammy told her about it. She was both nervous and excited and wanted us to continue. The only way I know of to contact Lydia is through her parents if they're still alive and if they still live in Mechanicsburg and if they still have a landline. I waited until Monday morning and talked to a private investigator. I asked him to help me find Lydia's parents and Kurt Weber. It took him 2 hours to get the parents' phone number, it took Weber a little longer. I called Lydia's parents, reminded them who I was, and told them I needed to talk to Lydia. I gave them my phone number to give to her. Not an hour later, my phone rang. Hello, this is Lydia Bowman. I was given this number. Hi Lydia, Fred here, yeah, how's it going? I asked, trying to think of something clever to say, but I couldn't. Actually, I'm doing great. How are you? Very well, Lydia. I need to talk to you about something very important. Okay, go ahead. Not over the phone. Tell me where we can meet, and we'll talk in person. Explain it to me. We haven't spoken in years, and suddenly out of the blue, you have something so important that it needs to be discussed in person. That's it. I'm sorry, Fred, I'm not buying it. Okay, but remember I gave you a chance. A chance at what? Come on, Lydia, what's the matter? Only in person. Lydia, call me if you change your mind. Wait, okay, goddammit. We live in Vegas, that's better. I'm flying out there tomorrow, and I'll call you when I land. You decide where you want to meet. The next day, we met in the lobby of the Bellagio Hotel. I guess she needed a lot of witnesses. Hi Lydia, hello Fred, this is my husband, Roland. Roland Bowman, hi Roland, I turned my attention back to Lydia. I need to see you alone for 10 seconds. Anything you have to say, you can say in front of Roland. Whatever you say, but this is about the hope you had. She turned pale. Can we still talk? Yes. He knows about her. Okay, let's sit down. We found as quiet a corner as we could, given where we were. I recommend something to drink. Wine will do, we agreed to a red, and I ordered it. Let's wait while we get some poured into our glasses. I paid for the wine, and we all took a sip. Her name is Sarah. She's graduating in 2 weeks and would like you to be there. Roland and I watched her pass out with a glass of wine in her hand without spilling a drop. Roland took the glass from her, set it down, and patted her cheeks until she regained consciousness. What did you say? I repeated it, then I pulled out the picture of Sarah, and showed it to Lydia. She began to cry, touching the picture as gently as she could. She's beautiful. Where? Where did you get her? I took a picture of her yesterday in her living room. You took it? How? Why? I told her the whole story from beginning to end. I even told her that we had tried to find Kurt Weber to invite him, but he seemed to have disappeared. She didn't realize I knew his name and was shocked a second time. She was stunned at first, but then she got angry. Why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you keep her from me all these years? Her voice grew louder and louder. Roland jumped up. Calm down, calm down. You gave up all rights to her. Fred is breaking the law by doing what he's doing now, so chill out. She calmed down. When can I see her? At her graduation. If you want to come, of course, I'll come. Can I see her sooner? You both need time to get used to it. Take your time. How about we get there the day before? She smiled. That would be wonderful. Now, how about I take a picture of you so she can see what you look like? Okay. We found a spot outside for her to pose. When I started to leave, she rushed over to me, hugged me, and started kissing all over my face and head. Not too demonstrative, is it? Asked Roland, laughing. I decided I liked him. That same afternoon, I flew back to prepare Sarah. I showed her a picture of Lydia. She's beautiful, Sarah said. She was very nervous but excited at the same time. For the first time since I'd known her, she hugged me. Thank you, Uncle Fred. Now we know where you draw your beauty, said Sammy, snuggling tightly against Sarah. Do you know what my birth father looks like? Sarah asked timidly. The other three adults looked at me with widened eyes, waiting to see what I would say. I thought for a second before I spoke. Let me tell you that you got your blonde hair and blue eyes from him. The three adults breathed a sigh of relief. We had only taken a week's vacation, so I had to go back to Alaska, but Joni stayed behind to help everyone prepare for the big day. I left for Alaska, promising to be back 2 days before graduation. The day before I was due back in Ken, I got a call from a private detective. The most he'd been able to find out about Weber was that after leaving government service, he'd taken a job as a consultant to the government of a Middle Eastern country. Like several other American consultants, he disappeared shortly after arriving in the country, and has not been seen since. I met Lydia and Roland at the airport and drove them straight to Sarah's house. When we entered, she was standing in the middle of the living room. I let Lydia go first. They looked at each other for a long time, then Lydia spoke. I brought you this, she said, pulling out a pacifier. It belongs to you, and I thought you might want it back.